Welcome to the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast, where we have real conversations about all things homeschooling from a Canadian perspective. I'm your host, Lisa Marie, with my co-host, Alina, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about Canadian historical fiction and how to add it to your homeschool days. So grab your favorite drink and come join us on the couch. All right, welcome back for another chat. Today, we're going to tackle a topic that is pretty common or popular in the homeschool community here. Historical fiction books, especially Canadian historical fiction books. So first of all, I'm going to ask you, Elena, do you guys use historical fiction in your homeschool?
Yes, a lot. We've always enjoyed historical fiction. I would say my oldest especially, like she's very, very into history, and that was sort of even more important to her. I also really enjoy history, so I think that kind of influences my desire to read lots of historical fiction books or like reading them out loud or give them to my kids over the years. I would say it's been a huge part in our homeschool.
Nice. See, in our homeschool, my kids, when the older ones, wouldn't sit for read aloud time. So we did some historical fiction when they were sitting around the table at lunchtime and were kind of preoccupied doing something else. And we did a couple of really great historical fiction that grabbed their attention, and that was fun. But in general, I haven't used it as much as I want to. So with my younger set, that's my plan, is to read more historical fiction with them. So yes, and I know it's a popular thing in the homeschool community, in particular for Canadian history, because a lot of times that's one of the best ways for a lot of people to teach Canadian history, to make it exciting and fun. So so first of all, maybe we should define what historical fiction is so that people understand. I will say that sometimes historical fiction is called living books. I know that's not always the full summary of what a living book is, but living books is a Charlotte Mason concept, talking about really quality literature that kind of brings things alive. So they make it a living experience, no matter whether it's history or it's science or that kind of thing. But it works particularly well in the historical context. So historical fiction is stories that are not real, that's the fiction part, that are based on maybe historical events and time periods, so that you can have the opportunity to learn more about that experience or that time period or that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description. I think sometimes the concept of, or the words living books throws people off. They're like, what's a living book? But I mean, basically it's an engaging book. It's something that isn't just dry and boring, like maybe you remember a textbook in school. It's something that really excites you and you want to keep reading. So that's kind of how I look at it is this book engaging, or are my kids going to think, oh no, here she goes again with, reading a book. If we start reading a book and everybody's bored, then I'll be like, hey, is anybody enjoying this? Because I'm not. And everyone's like, nope. Then we just end that one and try a different one. A book that you read out loud to your kids or that they're reading should be engaging and should be something that you're interested in and want to keep reading. I think that kind of defines a living book to me.
For me, some of the reasons that I think historical fiction really makes sense when you're teaching history is that it really provides an opportunity for kids to experience that particular event or that particular time period in a way that's relatable to them. I'm sure almost everybody is familiar with the story of Anne with an E, of Anne of Green Gables, and we think of it as one of our classics of Canadian literature. But it's a great opportunity for kids because they can often relate to Anne, whether that's because she's got a vivid and wild imagination, whether that's because she's desperately trying to find a place to belong, whether that's because she's got this on again, off again friendship relationship with Gilbert Blythe, or whether it's because she's trying to find a bosom buddy. We can all tend to find somewhere in there that we can understand and appreciate Anne. But we also, along the way, learn about life in the 1800s, about farm life and about PEI and about puff sleeves and about how schools were one room classrooms with slate boards that break over people's heads when you smack them. There's lots of things that we can learn about history from that book. So that's one example of why I think Canadian historical books are really helpful for us to bring to our kids when we're trying to learn about history. It's not just facts and figures, it's actual perspectives of people who lived in that time period.
Yeah, it's just a super engaging way of learning. You can't really, we can't time travel, so we can't go and experience it ourselves. So I would say that it kind of opens up our mind to the way things were. And there's something special about reading. It makes you kind of create pictures in your head. I know you can watch videos, and there's some even good videos out there about Canadian history, but it's so much more engaging, I think, to read sometimes because you get to create those images in your own head rather than have them on the screen. It also develops other areas of education like your vocabulary and even just when you're reading, either you're reading yourself or you're listening to it being read out loud to you, you're learning things like sentence structure and grammar and being descriptive and all those things. I find the more a child reads or is read to, the more they are able to have those things correct in their own writing. So their own ability to write, their own ideas about what to write about increase by their exposure to literature, and especially like quality literature and quality writing.
Hmm. So one of the things that I really think is awesome about historical fiction is that we can find, okay, so let's say we're studying the War of 1812. Or if we're studying, I'm trying to think of a good example here. We're trying to study a moment of Canadian history, and there are different perspectives of the people that were involved in that particular event. So if it's a even if it was the American Revolution, so we've got the loyalists versus the patriots, or I think that's the group. And then we've got different stories that are written from the perspectives of the different groups that participated in that event.
Yeah,
So this is really helpful as we start. I'm really excited to see how many more perspective pieces are coming out, especially written by those particular ethnicity groups, such as Indigenous people and Black history, and those kinds of things. But it also gives us opportunities to see things from different angles,
yeah,
so that we don't have just one skewed perspective on this is what happened. Because like a loyalist versus a patriot perspective is going to be a completely different experience of the war than it would be from each other. So I think that's really cool
yeah.
for us to be able to consider perspectives that we not necessarily have considered before. So that's always a
That's
useful thing
true.
to do. Another idea is that it really provides curiosity. So a lot of times, if you're reading a book about a specific moment of history, you are like, I wonder if that was real. Like, did that really happen? And so you may be curious to go Google it up. Like, okay, did that really happen? And then you can study it more and start down that rabbit hole of curiosity. I think that's a really great thing that comes out of historical fiction as well. So,
Yeah, and even just I know my kids say they read or have read to them a book on something, then they'll want to look up like, oh, what else did the author write? And maybe the author wrote other books about that time period, or maybe they wrote on a different historical topic, or maybe then they want to know, well, what other authors have written about, the War of 1812 or the Loyalists or whatever the topic is. And then it kind of leads to more ideas for things to read because they're interested because they were engaged by that one book we did read or they did read.
yeah. So, like, for example, the other thing I've seen is my kids will hear about an event and be like, "Oh, we read about that." So we were watching a
Yeah,
video or something, and like I think this wasn't Canadian history, but we'd read something about the Hindenburg explosion, and then the Hindenburg explosion showed up in one of our other programs that we were doing, and they're like, "Oh, we know all about that because we read it in a
yeah.
book," right? So that's
That's
always kind
always
of
so
cool too.
cool to see when they make connections. And even just like connections that aren't like direct, but like, oh, this relates to that. And yeah, I
Mm,
just think it opens up so much more than we can cover just by other methods of teaching.
yeah.
It'd be really cool if we could like go experience it. And that's where too, like I think it's really neat if you have the opportunity to go and see places that maybe they have a reenactment or maybe they have a museum or something, especially the ones that are more hands-on, like people that are dressed up or actual events that happen that you can go and see. I remember one time we done a lot of learning about Indigenous peoples, and then we went to a site in Southern Ontario that has Indigenous village, and like we'd read a lot about it, and then like about that time period and Indigenous peoples, and then we went and actually saw it in person, and like my kids were like, whoa, because it like comes alive. But
Mm,
the foundation of having read about it first makes a huge difference when you visit these places.
yeah.
So read about it first, then go see it, and their eyes just light up. They're like, wow, this really did happen. Like that was an actual site that they had found and archaeologists had discovered, and then they like rebuilt it the way it was. Pretty cool.
That is cool. Yeah, nice. Talking about different perspectives, as I said, one of the things that's been really interesting for me is to see the emergence and of books written by Indigenous authors about the Indigenous experience. So that's been
Yeah.
really cool for me. For anybody who's looking for a resource, one of the ones that I often recommend is a website called Strong Nations. They have a lot of really great quality books there. And actually, it was interesting because one of the books that I got was a hardcover picture book called The Pencil, and I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but it's Susan, starts with an A, and I believe it's Marin is her co-author, and I feel terrible that I will leave it in the show notes. But she had written a book called The Pencil, and it was about her experiences growing up in the North, living in an igloo, and how they got a pencil, and how special that pencil was because it was something unique and different for their family that they hadn't had before. And I never really thought, because we take pencils for granted. You think about how often we use them, but being able to see that experience through the eyes of a little kid who, like, they were cherishing this pencil and whittling it down to like a little tiny stub, but still using it as much as they possibly could. Think of how many pencils we've thrown away in our lifetime. But just kind of that perspective. And it really offered my kids a unique opportunity to see how different life was and is for different people across the globe, especially in our Indigenous communities here in Canada. So another one is seeing some of the different books regarding residential schools, such as When We Were Young or When We Were Alone. That's what it's called, When We Were Alone, and Fatty Legs, and those kinds of books that have come out recently. So those books can be really helpful because I found that they tend to broach the topic of um, residential schools and those very challenging conversations in a way that's more age appropriate for kids. So it gives us an opportunity
Yeah.
to provide them with the beginning of the conversations when they're younger, and then to expand into more difficult and more challenging books when we get older. So I thought that was, but I really love how we're seeing the growth of that. And I hope that we see more of the Black history, Black heritage kind of perspective books as well, because it would be really important for us to have, as I said, multiple perspectives on different moments of history. So I think that it's cool to see it growing, and I hope we continue to see it that way.
Yeah, I find that fascinating as well, like very helpful and very important. And I think that it's really neat how there's so many books too that are dealing with the younger age groups now. Oftentimes, there's some really great books that are written for maybe middle school, high school on some of these topics, but when you have young children, that's not something that you want to get into, or maybe you have children that are really sensitive to certain things. I know we've dealt with that in our school, in our homeschool, with just our kids having various being pretty sensitive about some topics. So, you want to introduce it and you want to have those conversations going and start the conversations, but at the same time, I mean, some of those things are pretty heavy. So
Mhm.
it's important to have those books that can address it at the younger level. I really appreciate that, because then it's an easier thing to kind of introduce. And then as they get older, you can talk about the heavier things according to, their age or how they're doing with their sensitivity, because it is important, obviously, to discuss the heavier things when they are older. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I find that really encouraging as well. I know I found quite a few books over the years about, residential schools, or there was a neat one that I had found, and it's written by a Métis author called The Tiny Voyager by Rebecca Wilson. And it was just a neat way to see the Voyager experience through a different light. And I
Mm.
think that was neat because oftentimes a lot of those books are just written by the perspective of the voyageurs. So that was another one that kind of has a different perspective. And there's a neat book. It's kind of a unique look at the explorers, not from a different people group, but this book is called A Dog Came Too, A True
Mhm.
Story by Ainsley Manson. And we own that one, and it's a picture book. And it's just really neat because it's kind of more from the perspective of the dog going with the explorers. And yeah, so it's pretty neat.
How do you decide which books to read with your kids for historical fiction? Do you have a plan or like a way that you filter or any of that kind of things?
Through the years, when they were younger, like I did a lot of like looking at the book itself, like just maybe flipping through it or reading the back or maybe reading about it online. And then often I would even when they're young, I would read it first myself so that I would maybe there's, some words that I wanted to filter or have a discussion about even. Like a lot of the time, some of the older books, they'll use terms and words that aren't considered appropriate now, but that were very common use then, even though they weren't appropriate. So we can have discussions depending on their level. So maybe when they're really little, maybe I'll just filter the word, or when when they're older, I'll say, hey, so this book uses this word. This is why it's not okay. Yeah, I would say like reading ahead or reading it ahead of time when they're little was a key thing that I did. As they got older, then, we'd already had those kinds of discussions. So it wasn't necessary, especially with like the sensitivity that we've had with a few of our kids. Some of them are more sensitive than others, and reading ahead and knowing like what was in it. Remember one
Mhm.
book in particular was like really, really good and I really loved it. But yeah, I just dealt with some really heavy things with one of the characters. And I just knew that, okay, if I read that section, that is not going to be good at this stage for my daughter. So we just read the rest of it and I put a sticky note over it and just skipped that. And then when she's older, she wanted to read it. And I was like, hey, you can totally read this, but just so you know, this is in it and whatever. And, at that point, she chose to read it, but we had a discussion about it. So that's something I've always done is just kind of reading ahead. And then obviously, as they get older, no, they have the foundation to make their own choices and understand things and think critically. But I think that's important when they are little to kind of help them develop those critical thinking skills about what would be a good book to read, what would be engaging, what would be important to know about, to think about, the context of when the book was written. All those kinds of things. I've often looked like in homeschool catalogs back when they were thing. Now it's online mainly for ideas. I always figured if it's in one of those catalogs, then it's probably a good resource. Asked other homeschool parents, looked online at different places that have lists. I know the one curriculum that we used had a whole bunch of books listed as part of that curriculum. The other thing with reading ahead is I really enjoy reading the books anyway. So sometimes I do that just for fun too, for myself. Those are kind of the strategies that we've used.
Yeah, good ideas. You brought up a good point about the older historical fiction books. So books that were
Yeah.
written maybe in the past that wouldn't necessarily fly today with publishing because of word choices or perspectives that
Yeah.
provide a really negative thing. However, it's interesting to me because there's a popular book that people like to read, and I remember trying to read it to make I don't want to call it out because I don't want to make anybody mad, but I remember reading it with my kids, and it had been highly recommended to me, and so I read it, and I had to stop because it was making me feel really sick to have the perspectives of the person involved. I think it's important for us to understand that, one, it's okay if we don't want to read something just because it's a popular thing. It's okay not to if we don't want to.
Oh
But
yeah.
it's also okay for us to use resources that may be kind of currently quote shunned because it's not from the voice or perspective or language that we currently are accepting of. Because it's
Yeah.
important for our kids to understand that the way we view the world and people and groups have changed over times. And
Yeah.
it's important for our kids to see the growth and change because if they don't understand what happened or what changed or why we can't say certain words, we're never going to be able to help them continue to grow that change.
Yeah.
And my kids were too young at the time, so I wasn't really ready to have these in-depth conversations about why we don't
Yeah.
call different groups different names. So I but
Yeah.
for me it was I don't think I'm going to keep reading this book anymore. Let's find something else to read. But there's lots of options available. If you're having a hard time with a book, please don't feel like you have to struggle through it.
Yeah.
There's other options available for almost every time period of history that
Oh yeah.
you can try instead. So if you can't stomach it anymore, you don't have to read it. I just want to give people permission in case
For
somebody's
sure.
feeling struggling
Yeah.
with that.
And I think,
So,
like you mentioned, like when the kids are younger, then obviously they're not ready for certain things. When they're older is when you can have more discussions at a different level. So I think too, like what you mentioned about how your kids like at different levels need different things and you have those discussions at certain levels, is that it's important to make sure your kids are exposed to some of those things because at some point they are going to come across it. So if you never have taught them that certain words aren't the words that we use anymore and they were used in the past, then at some point they're going to come across that and then they're not going to know about it. And they're going to be like, well, what's that? And, maybe they won't even know it's wrong, or maybe they will have a bunch of questions or those kinds of things. So I think it's important to have those discussions. And that's why I do use some resources sometimes that, like you said, wouldn't fly today with publishers because of whatever perspective, because then we can have those discussions. So I think that that's important. Otherwise, they're just not going to know about it and not going to understand the historical concept of we used to think or not concept, context of we used to think this way as a people group, and now this is why we're doing it this way, and this is why this is right, and why that was wrong, I think is really important. And I know some people are like, oh, we shouldn't be reading those books at all, but I just think that eliminating them and banning them doesn't give us the context of why it was wrong.
Yeah, we need a bigger picture than just erasing it out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I know the culture today often calls for just like, cancel that. We're not going to discuss that. And that's important in some senses, but in the other sense, we need to know why.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so there's some books that you can read which provide a Eurocentric perspective on particular moments of history, and they can be written really well and are really engaging and maybe really interesting and focused for your kids. My challenge for you is to make sure that you always consider another perspective, as we said before. So
Yeah.
if you're reading a story about the explorers who came to Canada, like Jacques Cartier and those kinds of things, you're going to want to see if you can find a perspective that isn't just about how wonderful and great Jacques Cartier was, because although his accomplishments in the European world were considered fantastic and wonderful, maybe they weren't considered so fantastic and wonderful from the indigenous perspectives, especially since
Yeah.
he like shoved a few on a boat and took them back to Europe against their will. But maybe you can find a perspective for that so that you can make sure that you're including all the options and all different angles to consider different events. So feel free to use the Eurocentric programs, but make sure you're not exclusively using them, because I think that it's important to make sure that we include different perspectives than maybe what we've been taught. I know my history classes in the past, it was very much like Canada didn't even exist before the Europeans showed up
Yeah.
and saved the day. So it's really important for us to make sure we have a variety of perspectives. And I know I said this like lots of times already, but for me, that's one of the best things that I think is when we're teaching Canadian history, that's really
Yeah.
important for us to do. So
Yeah. And I think that it's important, like I know things, having those discussions with our kids when we use those resources that, teach only from the European perspective, perhaps, is that, having those discussions like, okay, so this great explorer did that. Well, what do you think the effect was on the Indigenous people who already lived here? If you were them, how would you think you would be feeling? Like, and sort of having that and asking them those questions, and then it kind of opens their eyes to, oh, wow, like that wouldn't be good. So yeah, just really having the conversations in that way, asking them questions really has helped.
all right, so let's get into the conversation of book recommendations, because I know people always want to know, well, okay, do you have any good books?
Yeah.
So let's start with the early years. So for young learners, specifically for things like picture books or early chapter books for young.
So in terms of the younger kids' books, we do have a post on the website called Great Indigenous Books by Indigenous Authors for Kids. So again, talking about that perspective, there's a lot in the last few years that have come up that are from Indigenous authors. And I really love that because, again, it gives that perspective that was really missing, and that's not okay that it was missing. And so we have a whole bunch of recommendations. We have the age ranges. A lot of them are like grade 1 to 3. You can see there's like 4 to 7. A lot of these are picture books. And yeah, all of these on this list are by Indigenous authors. So there's ones about residential school. There's quite a few that discuss things like sort of living on the land and the different things that the different skills that they had and still have for those kinds of things. So that's a great place to start in terms of Indigenous books for young kids. I would say too that one I mentioned, A Dog Came True. I can't speak. A Dog Came To A True Story by Ainsley Manson. That one's a really enjoyable one that discusses one perspective about the explorers. Oh, there's another really great one called Africville, and we have reviewed that on the website as well. And that one really opened my eyes to, I mean, I grew up going to public school, and that was I never remember hearing about Africville. And yeah, so we have a whole book review about that, and a little bit more information about Africville and how these people were taken from their home. And it's just a beautiful picture book that introduces that concept to younger children. I'd really recommend checking that one out as well. Yeah, so as far as picture books, those are some of my favorites.
Okay, yeah, and also Elizabeth MacLeod is an author that writes for Scholastic Canada, and she has a lot of the meat series, which are about meeting different Canadian historical figures such as Viola Desmond and Mary Ann Chad Carey. And she also has people like Chris Hadfield, Terry Fox. And so there's lots of different historical figures, and they've got picture books as well with some actual real life pictures in the back, I believe, of them, most of them too. So that's helpful. Another popular series is the Canadian Flyer series, which are for earlier, which is a little bit more than picture books, but not quite into like middle elementary school. We're talking like it's a chapter book series, but it's like for younger readers a little bit, probably in the like grade 2 to grade 4 range for reading, depending on how advanced reader your child is. Those series are, I don't believe they're in print anymore, but they are stories of these two kids who find a magic toboggan, and it sends them back in different periods of time to like dinosaurs and like pirates and Vikings, different moments of Canadian history. So that one's a really popular series too. You can actually, when I was at a secondhand thrift store, I happened to find a couple of the books on the shelf for like $1.99. So check to see whether you can find things like that in secondhand bookstores.
My kids have really enjoyed the Canadian Flyer series, and yeah, it is out of print, but the library or perhaps even interlibrary loan, and that's actually something really good to mention in terms of historical books, is that some of the time, some of the really great books, even these ones that are, you know, only written maybe in the 2000s, it's not like, well, I sort of see that it's not very long ago. My kids would disagree, but I think to myself like, oh, like 1995, that wasn't that long ago. And then I'm like, oh,
Ew.
so yeah, so some of these books are available through interlibrary loan. If you don't know about interlibrary loan, I'm not sure how it is all across Canada, but I know at least in Ontario, I believe all, if not most, libraries have it. And you just request a book. I know on our library, you can do it on a piece of paper or right on the website. And you can request the book, and you have to have the author and the title. And sometimes you have to have the ISBN number, and then you need your library card and you can request it. And then my library, it takes usually 2 to 6 weeks, depending where it's located. This is for not the new books, though. The brand new books, you're not going to be able to find that way. That would be better to recommend your library purchase if you're not wanting to get it yourself. And my library does that as well, especially the really new books. They're always happy to take recommendations. And I would say about maybe 75% of the time, if it's new and a really neat perspective, they'll buy it. It might take several months, but it gets there. And so the interlibrary loan system is really cool because you can order a book from different libraries across Ontario. In our case, again, I don't know how it is across the rest of Canada, but I would assume that at least some places have it. And it's free. And so they always tell me if they can't get it, perhaps it's out of circulation, like a library doesn't want to circulate it because it's a really old book and they just don't want to chance losing it out of their library. But most of the time, I would say 95% of the time, I'm able to get those books, and it's really helpful. Just keep in mind the timing of getting them, because say you're studying, the War of 1812, and you want these specific historical fiction books, then you'll need to order ahead. Oftentimes you also can't renew them. Sometimes you can, but oftentimes you can't. So sometimes it hasn't worked out where we get it and we're like, oh, we're already done that. Or, oh, we haven't quite reached that yet. And we just read it anyway. But yeah, something really cool to be aware of in terms of getting those historical fiction books.
Good call.
Yeah. But back to the topic about books for young kids. There was one too that I haven't read yet, but it looks really interesting. And it's called Encounter. And it's by, how do you pronounce that last name? Brittany Luby, or maybe it's Luby. And it says, two people navigate their differences with curiosity and openness in this stunning picture book that imagines the first meeting between an Indigenous fisher and a European sailor. And the author is Indigenous. So there's another one that, a different perspective. Often we hear about the perspective of the European arriving and, doing what they do. But this has a bit of a different perspective. And again, for the younger kids. Okay, yeah, I know that there's another two books by author Barbara Smucker, Selena and the Bear Paw Quilt, and Selena and the Shoe Fly Pie. Both are set in the 1860s, and they involve a Mennonite family during the Civil War that immigrate to Canada. So that's kind of a different, unique perspective in terms of, why the Mennonite people would immigrate, and, immigration from the US to Canada, which is a topic that is kind of neat to cover because it did happen quite a bit. Those two books deal with that, but again, from like a younger kid's perspective, they're picture books. Yeah, I know too that as you get a little bit older, a really neat series to get into is Our Canadian Girl. My kids have really enjoyed those. Again, they're out of print, but you could get them maybe through the library, interlibrary loans, secondhand bookshops. They come either as I think 4-part for each girl, and either like that, or they have them like all in one volume, like a 4-part volume all in one book. I've mainly seen them as a separate ones. Even like if you can get just say the first one, I know that they're often easier to find. They're a really neat read. We've really enjoyed those, and they cover such a huge variety of topics across Canada and across the years. I really wish these books were still in print, the Canadian Flyer ones as well. They're really great for a bit older or to read out loud. And as well, the Dear Canada series. That's a really great series. I would say they're maybe even a step up from the Our Canadian Girl. They're a bit longer, a thicker book. Go into, depending on the topic, they can go into some heavier topics. So you might want to have a look at that if you have a child that's sensitive and kind of weed out those. I remember when my oldest first started reading them, I would say like, hey, here's a stack of these. And then there's certain ones that we save for a little bit older. So we really enjoyed those. They're from more like a diary perspective. Yeah, we've always enjoyed reading those. The library had a whole ton of them.
If you are have boys in particular, they have the I Am Canada series, which are written from the male perspective, and they aren't written as a diary, they're written as story context, but they are from Scholastic. They're basically the same family of books. That's kind of what they call them. They have them on par with each other that way. Another
Yeah.
Another really popular author is Pierre Burton. So he wrote a lot of historical fiction, especially for middle school kind of grade level books. Most of his stuff is also out of print. The problem with a lot of Canadian historical fiction is that it goes out of print just because we don't have the sheer numbers of people buying them that they can get out of other historical fiction books. But that's why you often find they aren't out of print, but are out of print. But you can find them in libraries. I've got them used from thrift stores. I have quite a few in a collection that I got over the years, but he writes some really great stuff. He grew up in the Yukon sometime around the I want to say the 1950s, but he had lots of history back in that family as in his family as well. So he wrote some really great books. And this is about I'd say elementary school, middle school is about time that a lot of the classics start coming out. So this is where you'd find Anne of Green Gables, maybe the more towards the middle school years, the grade 6, grade 7, grade 8 level. But Anne of Green Gables and Jack London, The Call of the Wild, The Stories of the Yukon, and Farley Mowat, and his stories about the North, and that Scatterbrained Bookie, which is a really popular series about the Depression years. And then Kit Pearson writes books about World War II called The Sky is Falling. There's a whole series about them, about a family of kids come to Canada to get away from the war. And there's also an author called Eric Walters who writes about the World War II and the spies that were being trained in Whitby, Ontario, in Camp X. So there's some different book series that you can do. Those are some of the more common and well-known authors, I think, about Canadian historical fiction.
I would say that the ones by Kit Pearson, The Sky is Falling, and there's 2 more books in that series. I mean, they've been around since I was a kid, and they were one of my favorite series when I was younger. Definitely worth reading those. I found that really fascinating that people in Europe sent some of their kids, not everybody, but some people sent some of their kids to Canada to be safer. And so that's quite an interesting topic. They're very well written. My kids really enjoyed Elijah of Buxton by Christopher Paul Curtis. It's about the Underground Railroad. We really enjoyed the 2 books by, I think it's Celia Barker Lottridge, called Ticket to Curlew and Wings to Fly. They were set in Alberta, in the kind of when they were settling that area. Another one that kind of spans the younger years and older years is there's a bunch of books by Barbara Greenwood. One is Gold Rush Fever. There's a Pioneer Story, also known as a Pioneer Sampler, depending which edition. The one right says on it, I think it's a daily life in Canada in the 1800s, but the other one takes out all the Canadian references. That one's easier to find, but it's literally the same thing, just without the Canadian references. Very well written, very engaging because it has hands-on projects. It has quite a bit of pictures, but it also has quite a bit of writing that can kind of engage the older kids a bit. I would say up to, say, middle school age. There's The Last Safe House, about the Underground Railroad, all by that author. And they're all set up in the same way. They're kind of a bigger, more picture book size, but they're thicker and have those hands-on projects, interesting information, kind of follow a storyline, but have like nonfiction in it as well. We really enjoyed those ones. We really enjoyed the historical fiction series by Bill Freeman. We also really enjoyed Pit Pony by Joyce Barkhouse. And I know there was one that was really neat in terms of if you have any child that's struggling with something. In particular, this book is written, the character has dyslexia. So that one was kind of neat for us as I have a child with dyslexia. It's called Irish Chain by Barbara Haworth Attard. And it takes place during the Halifax explosion. And we also really enjoyed a series about the Loyalists by Jean Ray Baxter. Well, not just about the Loyalists, but it's set during that time period. She has a big series all about that. And then also set during the fur trade, there was The Broken Blade and Wintering by William Dubbin, I think is how you say it. Oh, I did forget one, sorry. I have a lot of books I like, as you can see. Yeah, there's a series of 2 by Connie Brummel Crook, The Hungry Year and The Perilous Year. Really enjoyed those, as well as by Mary Beacock Fryer. There's Escape, Adventures of the Loyalist Family, and its sequel. So yeah, those are our top favorites that we've enjoyed over the years that are been engaging, and most of them I've read out loud. So yeah.
There is 2, and I wish I could find them. They're not on my shelf for me to remember at the moment, but there were 2 series that I enjoyed reading when I was doing book reviews. They are on the website if you want to find them, but they are stories of people who basically time travel to different historical fiction, historical natural disasters. So like,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
so there's one like the Halifax explosion is one, and there's also one
Was
where
it
they
the
go.
Disaster Strikes series, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's one of them. The other one's by Kathy Beveridge, and there's like a set of twins, and they keep getting sucked into different historical moments. So one of the cool things about them is because they are natural disasters, kids tend to really love them because it sounds like something that could happen to them. Like, oh, a tornado's coming or a hurricane or whatever, those things. I like one of the things that I found funny was that there was one all about the ice storms in Quebec. Then I'm like, wait a minute, I remember that. How is that? How is that history?
Yeah, I know. No, that series my kids have enjoyed too. I forgot about that one. Another neat thing too that has even become more popular in the last little bit is graphic novels. And so I have come across a few that are written from a Canadian history perspective. So there's a few that we actually reviewed for the blog, and the publisher is Teach Magazine. So this one in particular I'm looking at is called Golden Boys, the Winnipeg Falcons of 1920. I'd never even heard of the story, and these are beautiful graphic novels. And yeah, the author is Paul Keary. And yeah, I did a whole review of it, and you can learn a little bit more. There's a Heritage Minute that we kind of inserted into the post there about it. So yeah, if you have a child who's interested in hockey and more the graphic novel format, I would definitely say to check that out. There's one as well about suffrage. And there's one as well called No Reason to Apologize, though I do have to caution, I mean, you can read in the review, but that one kind of was a little bit heavier. So yeah, we really in particular enjoyed Golden Boys and Suffrage as 2 graphic novels that I would really recommend.
Yeah, and there's another book that I don't know if it's still in publication or not, but it was called The Locksleys and the War of 1812. It was a graphic novel as well. And I
Oh
believe
yeah.
at one point they had a short animation version of it that you can see on the National Film Board website.
Yeah, there's so many good books. It's kind of hard to
We don't have to
point a
cover all of
few.
them.
I just get too excited for sure. Okay. So yeah, I wanted to highlight too a series for even older. I guess too the series by Jean Ray Baxter that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, I would say is more high school or maybe upper middle school, depending. There is a little bit of, oftentimes, and I almost wish sometimes they leave it out, but oftentimes these books contain a bit of romance and nothing like, it totally inappropriate. But I just sometimes I'm like, oh, like I want to give that to my 10-year-old, but do I really want them thinking about those kinds of things? So yeah, so some of these books, definitely the Jean Ray Baxter series. I mean, my daughter read those in high school. I wouldn't say that it's a main focus from what I remember. I read them too, but it's there. And one author that definitely fits that category for the older kids. I know she recommends her books for grade 7 and up, but personally, my own feeling would be it would be for high school. Genevieve, or maybe she pronounces it Genevieve, I'm not sure. And her last name's Graham. So the one that we reviewed for the website is Come From Away. And I know in my library, they have these in the adult section, but I definitely say high school. I mean, you can start reading books that are in the adult section. Yeah, it contains some romance, but nothing, again, inappropriate. But it's a really neat perspective, and I definitely recommend checking out some of her books if you have a high schooler that is interested in that Canadian historical fiction as well.
All right, so we've got lots and lots of amazing books that we can recommend. And if you need more, we've got lots of lists and more. On the website, you can find lots of book lists. So we do have recommendations for various topics that you can look up the list for. We also have a historical fiction list on the website. I believe it's listed under living books, but we have a bigger one, which you can purchase, which is like 100 pages long of book recommendations that have been separated out by different topics, different periods of history. So then, and I believe there's grade recommendations, so you know kind of what level it's intended for. And then you can
Yeah, there
look
is.
through to find out something that's specific for what you're studying right now. So that's one option that you could do as well.
Yeah, so that does have the grade recommendations, and it also has, where possible, marked with different perspectives. So, say, Indigenous authors are marked as Indigenous authors, that kind of thing, so that people are wanting a certain perspective, then they can find it more easily.
Mhm. Great. And some other places that you can find historical fiction lists are even Donna Ward's Northwood Press website has book collections that you can buy, but you can also just look on her website if you're trying to find different books. One of the neat things, I've chatted with Donna a little bit recently, and she said that they are taking some of those out of print novels and she is getting permission to republish them. So that's some
Well,
really
that's
cool
awesome.
things. Yeah. So some of the books that, not all of them, but she's been putting some of the different books through. Another website is called 49th Shelf. They have a kids section as well that you can look.
I know, Lisa, you just mentioned Donna Ward. Some people might know her as Northwoods Press. It kind of goes by both on the internet, but that's important if you're trying to figure out, well, who's Donna Ward. So
Mm.
she owns Northwoods Press and has created different curriculum and has a website with a whole bunch of different books on it, as you said.
So I guess the next question is, how do you incorporate historical fiction into your homeschool? I was kind of thinking that we can just use the books on their own, just even for casual conversation, and just build a curriculum kind of based around the books that you're reading as one option. So you can make readings and then study more for each of the topics. And if you're doing a Canadian history program, you can always find books to come alongside with the topics that you're currently studying.
That would be how we've mainly done it, is like, okay, we're going to study this year in Canadian history. We generally would follow something where we do like these topics, and then we would just find resources that had to do with those topics, and then we'd read them during studying of that. That kind of worked for us. I guess it's kind of more like a unit study approach. Yeah, so, and then also my one daughter, you just could not keep her in books. She would just go through so many books. And so oftentimes, once we had covered a topic, then I would find another book on that topic or something, and I'd be like, here, read this, or, oh, I'm going to read this out loud. So yeah, I found it was always a good time, like you said, to read out loud at lunchtime. I found that I was more awake, which helped. My kids have a joke. Sometimes they call it the reading stroke, where I just start to fall asleep reading and I start to jumble all my words. So it's they kind of laugh about that. And yeah, so at lunchtime I was more awake than in the morning or in the evening at bedtime. I found that a good time to read, because, and I still do that with my little guy, is oftentimes I will finish eating, and kids, especially when they're younger, they're still eating. And then as some of them got older, we had a drawer near the table where we would have art supplies, and they would pull out some stuff and just do whatever. Oftentimes even just coloring those, I don't know, they're like adult coloring pages that have like flowers and stuff like that. They liked coloring and those kind of things while I was reading, and it kept them engaged and busy. Either they're eating or they were doing art stuff that was, they could do on their own, and we would use that as a reading time. Another idea that is kind of neat that we haven't really mentioned a lot is audiobooks. I know that for us, we have access to Hoopla through our library and Libby through our library. I like Hoopla because it's always available. Libby, you often have to put stuff on hold and wait. If it's a popular book, sometimes it's a
Hmm.
huge wait. And then obviously there's other things online where you can get audiobooks, but I like those because it's free with my library card. And we found quite a few historical fiction that way that we could listen to, especially for the times when, I struggle with chronic health issues, or I remember when I was pregnant with my son, I just got so tired and reading out loud was difficult, so we would all listen together to an audiobook. So that's a neat way of incorporating it. Maybe you struggle with something that you need a break, or maybe you don't enjoy reading out loud, or maybe you want to assign it to a child, hey, like go play with your Legos or do crafts. Like my one daughter likes latch hook kits, so do that. Or my one daughter crocheted, so she would crochet and listen to an audiobook. And it just kind of allows them a time where they can be doing something else, or you can be doing something else while you're listening. It gives your voice a break. Maybe you are sick or something and your voice isn't the best. So yeah, we've done that over the years too. Can't find everything on audio, but you can find a fair amount.
And if you're like my family where your kids are just too active to get a lot of those read aloud times together, the car is a great place to do audiobooks because you have a captive audience. So you can stick on whatever you want for audio in the time, and you can have books reading along with you on the ride. So
yeah, we've done that a lot too. A lot, especially like longer trips to visit relatives. We've done a lot of audiobooks through the years for sure. Okay, so today we've talked quite a bit about historical fiction. We've given you some places to find them. We've given you ideas about how to incorporate them into your homeschool, audiobooks, or reading them at specific points of the day, or maybe in the car. So we hope that that gives you lots of great ideas for your homeschool and enjoying some historical fiction.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining me today. I love that you guys read so much that you have great recommendations.
Thanks. Yeah, it's something that I guess I'm pretty passionate about, so have lots of ideas.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and I guess we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast. We hope you discovered some new ideas of historical fiction to add to your Canadian history studies. And speaking of Canadian history, in our next episode, we're going to tackle the myth that Canadian history is boring. If you have any feedback or ideas for topics or people we should connect with for interviews, please let us know. Don't forget to share this podcast with your Canadian homeschooling friends. Thanks so much for joining in. Until next time, happy learning.